Prince Harry's return to the UK was supposed to be a moment of reconciliation, a step towards healing, or so he thought. But what he encountered wasn't the warm reception he might have hoped for. Instead, what greeted him was the starkest silence imaginable. As he walked past the rows of soldiers, not a single salute was offered, not even a nod of acknowledgement. To someone who once wore that very uniform, who had served in Afghanistan and proudly stood before these same men, the omission wasn't just a snub. It was a public erasure. This wasn't some casual oversight. The military, with its rigid protocols, operates like a well-oiled machine. And in that moment, it wasn't about personal feelings. It was a statement. No salute, no recognition. It was like Harry wasn't even there. For a prince, for a military man, this moment spoke louder than any words could. It wasn't a dramatic act, no raised voices or glaring insults. It was cleaner, colder, an act of pure omission. And as the footage spread like wildfire across social media, the world saw it. This wasn't just a personal slight, it was a deep symbolic gesture. To many, it felt like the ultimate betrayal. A prince, once the darling of the military, now rendered invisible. And that stark silence, as the guards stood motionless, became the real headline. No one needed to say anything. The message was loud and clear. Harry had stepped away, and now, the very institution he once represented had turned its back on him. Harry's UK visit wasn't just about the cold reception from the military. It was the culmination of a much deeper fallout. Over the past few years, he had slowly distanced himself from the royal family and its traditions, diving headfirst into a world that was far removed from his roots. Deals with Netflix, high-profile interviews, and explosive documentaries became his new reality, a far cry from the royal duties he once proudly fulfilled. But with each step away, the line between the rebellious prince and a celebrity outsider became blurrier, and the backlash grew stronger. For some, Harry's decisions were seen as acts of courage, a man choosing authenticity over a stifling royal life. He was challenging the outdated norms, speaking truth to power, and carving out his own path. But for others, his actions were perceived as a betrayal. He wasn't just leaving behind an institution, he was airing its dirty laundry for all to see. With every interview, every revelation, the divide only deepened. The respect he once earned seemed to fade, replaced by a sense of disillusionment. When Harry walked into the UK this time, the weight of his past choices was impossible to ignore. As he passed the silent soldiers, his own body language told a story, tense, uncomfortable, and a far cry from the confident swagger he once carried. The prince who had once stood at attention in his military uniform now seemed out of place, a visitor in a kingdom that no longer felt like home. His body, stiff and closed off, reflected the inner conflict of a man caught between two worlds, one he had walked away from and one that no longer seemed to welcome him. Even in her absence, Meghan Markle's influence loomed large over Harry's visit. Whether she was physically present or not, her name echoed in every conversation, every social media post, and in the eyes of the public. For many, Meghan represented the catalyst for Harry's break with the royal family. Some saw her as a supportive partner who helped him find his voice and break free from an institution that had held him captive for years. To others, she was the reason Harry had walked away from everything: his duty, his heritage, and, perhaps most importantly, his place within the royal fold. Her absence during this UK visit seemed almost deliberate. Some speculated that Meghan stayed in California to avoid any more drama or distractions. Others saw it as an indication of a deeper, permanent rift between her and the royal family. Whatever the reason, her decision not to accompany Harry only added fuel to the fire. Critics were quick to place blame on her influence, while supporters rallied around the idea that she had empowered Harry to speak his truth, regardless of the consequences. But whether critics or supporters were right, one thing was undeniable: Meghan's shadow was impossible to escape. It lingered in the media, in public perception, and perhaps even in the way Harry was treated during his time in the UK. It wasn't just his actions that were being scrutinized. It was the woman by his side who, for better or worse, had become as much a symbol of his departure from the monarchy as Harry himself. And in the quiet moments of this trip, when the silence spoke louder than words, it was clear that the story was never just about Harry. It was about both of them, and the complex narrative they had built together. When Harry returned to the UK, there was a stark absence of the usual royal pageantry that accompanied a visit of his stature. No motorcade rolled through the streets. There were no ceremonial flag raisings or fanfare to greet him. The palace didn't issue a press release, and staff were reportedly instructed to maintain a strictly professional demeanor, leaving no room for even the slightest gesture of warmth. This wasn't just a royal visit gone wrong, it was a carefully crafted silence, a deliberate stripping of the royal treatment that Harry had grown so accustomed to. For someone like him, raised in the spotlight, accustomed to grand ceremonies and public adulation, this lack of recognition must have felt jarring. The absence of the usual protocols, no red carpets, no cheers, no grand displays, wasn't just about practicality, it was a message. You're no longer part of this world in the same way. Harry, once accustomed to the flashes of cameras and the buzz of excitement that followed him wherever he went, found himself standing in a different light. His visit felt less like a prince's return and more like the arrival of just another famous figure, one whose presence could no longer be guaranteed the same respect. Even as he smiled for the cameras and waved to onlookers, his body language betrayed him. Gone was the relaxed, confident royal. Instead, there was a man caught in the awkwardness of trying to fit back into a space that no longer felt like home. The weight of his past decisions, his exit from royal life, his outspoken criticisms had left an indelible mark. And in the absence of ceremony, it was clear this visit wasn't a celebration of his return. It was a quiet reminder that not even the prince is exempt from the consequences of his choices. The most striking part of Harry's return wasn't the absence of ceremony or the stiff body language. It was the military's cold response. For a man who had once proudly worn the Blues and Royals uniform, who had served in Afghanistan and earned respect from his comrades, the lack of any acknowledgement from the soldiers was both personal and public. As he walked past them, not a single one of the guards flinched. No salute, no glance, no recognition, nothing. In that moment, Harry wasn't just a prince. He wasn't even a former soldier. He was invisible. The silence from the military wasn't a fluke, and it wasn't just a matter of a few rogue guards acting out of line. It was a direct message, a message that had been carefully planned and executed with military precision. In the royal world, saluting isn't just a gesture, it's a symbol of respect, an acknowledgement of duty and loyalty. You don't just get saluted because you show up, you get saluted because you still belong to that world. And in that moment, Harry didn't belong. For many watching, it was an unsettling sight. An heir to the throne, once beloved by the military, now ignored. This wasn't just a snub, it was a repudiation. The uniform, once a mark of pride, had been stripped of its significance. Harry had walked away from the monarchy, and in doing so, he had left behind his place in this world. The message was undeniable. No matter how much you've given, no matter the sacrifices you've made, if you step away from the institution, you lose your standing within it. That's the brutal reality of the royal system. Loyalty is everything. And when you turn your back on tradition, tradition doesn't hesitate to turn its back on you. Behind the walls of the palace, the tone was no warmer than it had been on the streets. Harry's meetings with King Charles, though private, were described as distant and transactional. Reports suggested there were no heartfelt conversations, no personal reunions. Just tea, a brief exchange that barely lasted an hour, and a silence that hung heavier than words ever could. There were no cameras, no official photos, no public statements released afterward. The palace, it seemed, had mastered the art of neutrality. Harry might have stepped back into the palace, but he didn't step back into the fold. To the outside world, the lack of warmth and formality seemed odd for a family that once prided itself on tradition and unity. For someone accustomed to grand gestures and royal ceremonies, this chilly reception must have felt like a cold slap. Harry wasn't treated as a son returning to his family, he was treated as a visitor, no more significant than anyone else. And in a way, that was perhaps the most painful part of the entire visit, being handled with polite detachment rather than embraced with familial warmth. The coldness wasn't just in the absence of ceremony, it was in every interaction. The royal family is known for keeping emotions tightly controlled, but this was something else entirely. It was as if Harry had crossed a line, and now no amount of royal blood could restore his place. He wasn't an enemy, but he wasn't family either. The precision of the royal protocol ensured that he would be treated with the same clinical detachment as any other outsider, leaving Harry to face the reality of his estrangement from the very institution that had defined his life for so long. As Harry's visit unfolded, the media and the public went into overdrive, dissecting every second, every gesture, and even the absence of gestures. The footage of the military's cold response went viral almost instantly, sparking a wave of reactions across social media platforms. Some defended Harry, claiming that the soldiers' actions were inappropriate and disrespectful. Others, however, saw it as a fitting consequence for a man who had chosen to step away from the royal family. The message was clear. You can't walk away from centuries of tradition and expect to return without consequence. The media played its part too, analyzing every detail of Harry's trip with the precision of a tabloid microscope. What he wore, who he spoke to, and even the routes his car took became fodder for the masses. Every moment was scrutinized, and every silence was turned into a headline. For a man who had once been the subject of adoration, now even his most casual actions were subject to intense public examination. The reactions, though, were split. Some sympathized with Harry, seeing him as a prince who dared to challenge an outdated system. To them, his treatment seemed unfair, the product of a rigid institution unwilling to evolve. But for others, Harry was a man who had chosen his path, and now he was facing the consequences of turning his back on the very institution that had given him everything. The public debate raged on, with no clear consensus emerging. But one thing was undeniable. The optics of this visit were harsh. The silent soldiers, the cold reception, the media frenzy. It all added up to something much bigger than just a family dispute. It was a public reckoning, a reminder that actions, especially when made in the spotlight, have consequences that stretch far beyond the individual. For Harry, this visit wasn't just another royal duty or family gathering. It was a reckoning. It wasn't just about repairing relationships with his family, nor was it about rekindling ties with the institution he once served. It was a confrontation with the reality that, no matter how much fame or fortune he amassed, there would be no shortcuts back into the royal fold. The moment he chose to step away from his royal duties, he essentially left behind the privileges that came with that title, including the loyalty and respect that once flowed freely from the palace and the military. The silence from the soldiers, the lack of ceremony, the coldness from his family. It all underscored one painful truth: loyalty, in this world, is a currency that once spent doesn't come back. Even for someone born into one of the most powerful families in the world, respect isn't a given. It's earned, and once it's lost, it's incredibly hard to regain. And yet, there was no dramatic confrontation or heated argument. The royal family doesn't need to make a scene. Instead, they let moments like these, small, seemingly insignificant actions, speak louder than any words ever could. The message was subtle but powerful. Harry had made his choices, and those choices came with consequences. The royal world doesn't welcome back those who turn their backs on it. Whether Harry ever realizes it or not, the door to full acceptance has closed. And for now, at least, it seems there's no going back. As Harry prepared to leave the UK, the tone of his visit remained unchanged. There was no grand departure, no salute, no final show of respect, just a quiet exit that mirrored the muted arrival. The contrast between his former life and his current reality couldn't have been more stark. What was supposed to be a moment of peace, a chance to heal old wounds, ended up reinforcing the deep divide between Harry and the royal family. The lingering question, though, is whether there's any path forward. Can Harry ever be fully welcomed back into the royal fold, or has his departure forever altered the nature of his relationship with the family and the institution? The cold treatment he received wasn't just a reflection of personal feelings. It was a clear statement from the monarchy. Loyalty, above all else, is what matters. Once that loyalty is broken, it's incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to regain. In the royal world, actions speak louder than words, and Harry's actions, his Netflix deals, his interviews, his public criticisms have left a permanent mark. He's now a symbol of conflict and unresolved drama, a reminder that the crown doesn't chase after those who step away from it. The silence he faced, whether from the soldiers or the palace staff, wasn't just about personal grievances. It was about the power of tradition, the weight of centuries-old expectations, and the harsh reality that, in this world, loyalty is currency that once spent can never be fully recovered. As Harry left, the door didn't slam shut. It didn't need to. The message had been made clear without a single word spoken. The institution doesn't need to chase, it simply waits. And for Harry, the question now isn't whether he can return. It's whether he's willing to rebuild the trust and loyalty that have been lost along the way. Whether he ever steps back into the royal world, that's a road he'll have to navigate alone.